Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And welcome to the Ethereum in Finance, a view from Singapore. It brings me a great pleasure today to introduce the key speakers for today's event. I think just by way of backdrop, the Ethereum Finance brings together a number of experts in this field, looking at the growth and development of digital assets, including Ethereum, which have deep roots in Singapore. So Singapore has served two important bridges, one between traditional finance and decentralized finance, DeFi, and the other one is to link between Western countries to Southeast Asia and China. These events will explore Ethereum in finance from the viewpoint of our noted experts in Singapore. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Daniel Lee, Executive Director, Head of Business and Listing of the DBS Digital Exchange. Hi, Daniel. Welcome.
Hi, good morning.
Over to you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful panel. I think that digital asset now is actually at an inflection point that we're going to see more and more institution adoption into this space. And we have a great panel here that will share about how we can use enterprise Ethereum to bring institution into this space, and also to share with us some of the great trends that's happening in this space. I'll ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves now. First, Alan, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Alan. So I head up the FinTech Infrastructure Office at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So the FinTech Infrastructure Office is really responsible for strategies and initiative to drive and encourage innovation in the financial services sector. So we seek to establish platforms, global platforms for connectivity. And we look across a broad range of technologies to understand the opportunities, the risk, and the goal is to create a safe space for innovation to thrive. So thanks, Daniel, for having me here.
How about Charles?
A very good morning. My name is Charles. I'm the Managing Director for ConsenSys here in APAC. We have offices in Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and Japan. Before joining ConsenSys, I was with the Hong Kong government as head of FinTech. And what we do here with the team at ConsenSys is essentially, as we did for the past 6 years, enabling the developers, enabling the very fast growth of the internet third generation or Web3. We are helping with MetaMask, which celebrates today 21 million users, the developers, the end users, to connect to this new generation of internet and explore NFTs, DeFi, and many other topics. But we also enable a lot of enterprises and central banks via ConsenSys Quorum, Infura, and some other services to build central bank digital currencies as well as stable coins and many other enterprise applications. But I'm sure we're going to come back to those a little bit later in the conversation.
Vinoy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Daniel, and hi, co-panelists. It's a pleasure and privilege to be part of this. So thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning and good evening to everyone. Vinoy Kumar, Standard Chartered Bank. I have the privilege of setting up and running the Digital Asset Center of Excellence, Standard Chartered. And that has allowed me to take a very, very close look at a diverse set of activities and projects and initiatives in digital asset space. I'll keep it short and we let Daniel get into the meat of the conversation. I did just want to mention one thing, is that the views expressed today are my personal views, and they don't represent the views of the organization that I work for. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to get each of the panelists to share a bit about what they think about this landscape, the evolving landscape in digital asset space. Maybe we'll start with Vinoy now.
Thanks, Daniel.
About what you think?
Sure. Thanks for that, Daniel. And before I kind of get into what activities or where do we see this, I think it's put it in a context. It's good to step back and look at this, right? And why it's also relevant. So I would say that if you look at commerce and finance, historically, it has been kind of affected or troubled by lack of connectivity, lack of trust, complex administrative costs or hurdles, issues, and high costs, right? And if you look at digitalization of commerce and the technology, it enables trustless transactions, instantaneous and atomic settlements. And if you look at it, it addresses administration cost issues as well as a high cost overall, right? I mean, I think it does that. So it is very, very natural that what we are starting to see is that wherever there is the old intermediated models, which I say, which suffer from, you could say, long settlement times or high overheads or costs, will be threatened or will be looking for replacement or disruption, right? So I think that's one of the things. That's number one. So that's, if you look at that, the second thing which you have to think is that it is all of these things are not going to happen at the same pace. Because if you look at it from a financial services perspective, regulations, institutional focus, a lot of things matter, right? And therefore, things are not going to happen at a uniform pace across jurisdictions, across players, and everything else. So everything has a context. So we are seeing a varying degree of, I would say, initiatives or activities in that. So that's number two. And we have to be comfortable with that because this is going to be an evolution. It's not going to be a revolution where you get to Web 3.2 on day one. Of this evolution, right? So I think, but what we're seeing in Asia Pacific is very, very interesting and on several dimensions. One is, I would say, the public and sector participation, which is quite, I think it's more nuanced and quite different than many other parts of the world. That is number one. And number two is, like I was alluding to earlier, is that we are seeing activities at various horizon levels, which is like level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of horizon levels in terms of evolution, if you look at it, right? So if you look at it on the first point, I would say we see a very, very active participation of central banks and public sector in initiatives. So central bank digital currencies, if you look at it, we all know about China. If you look at Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, all of them are at different stages of evaluation, commentary, and and in different stages of Hong Kong, different stages of exploration. So I mean, I think this is one. Cross-border multi-currency payment solutions. Very, very topical. If you look at BIS, for example, is very, very active along with some central banks in that. And that's something which is very encouraging to see. Tokenization is the other area which we see is something which is on the radar of, and this is very progressive, I would say. And if you look at from the private sector, it's not very surprising that we are starting to see activities at infrastructure level. So you see lots of custodial solutions. You see lots of exchanges, centralized exchanges or otherwise. And if you look at stable coins or tokens, tokenization in general, and several payment solutions. I mean, the number of payment solutions which you are starting to see, which use crypto tokens, etc., is mind-boggling. I think it's just starting to people or businesses are starting to recognize that this is a huge opportunity to drive efficiency to this, right? The other one which is important, becomes important, especially in emerging sector, is that the activity in startups and the funding. We're starting to see multiplications in what funding is being raised and what is being deployed, as well as a number of startups which are starting to come up, right? Last but not least, I mean, I'm sure you'll cover this during the conversation at some stage, but regulatory activity, I would say, is focus on regulations and how to define the scope and perimeters around this is very important, and that's gone under the radar of all the major regulators in the region, I would say. So these are all activities which I think are going towards shaping the future of digital assets in financial services and transformation of financial services over time.
Thank you, Vinoy. Charles, would you like to share your thoughts about the trends?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Vinoy. I think Vinoy have covered quite a bit of topics which are really important. Maybe I just want to pause and get back to some numbers. We are focusing on the growth of Ethereum, and this space have been seeing just massive growth. So today there is about 200 million Ethereum addresses in the world. The number of DeFi users globally is reaching 5 million users, and we see this growth growing just exponentially. So usually this kind of trend is really like following the same pattern as the internet in the early days, where it starts slow and suddenly just exploding. And I think we are just at the beginning of this explosion of use, and it's really the catalysts are coming from multiple fronts. As Vinoy mentioned, I think the regulators and governments have been doing their research work. They've been also helping the ecosystem to shape, giving guidance as much as they can on topics they will be responsible for. I'm thinking of the EEA works with Project Ubin, which have started long time ago, many years ago. So it's a journey which is including many participants, and everyone has been learning along the way. If I remember well, the Cbdc challenge again by the EEA has brought 300 participants and applications. So it's just showing the liveliness of this ecosystem here in Asia, where there is a very strong demand for that. So I think it's fascinating. The trend we are seeing very strongly is first I would say the endorsement to the technology in general of blockchain technology by multiple regulators. At ConsenSys, we have the privilege to be involved in various Cbdc projects, central bank digital currency projects from Australia, Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong, and Korea. So that's one very big trend. It really shows that there will be, in some shape or forms, very core component of our societies which will be sitting on blockchain infrastructure, and Ethereum is really at the heart of this new infrastructure being built. Another very big trend we are seeing is the acceleration of entrepreneurs as well as big players from the Web 2, so the traditional internet, the internet of content, the internet of social media, which are essentially started their migration to the Web 3. And that's where Ethereum is also bringing a lot of solutions for them. Obviously, it kind of stresses the infrastructure, and the network can be sometimes on very high demand, but there is solutions with layer 2s and many others which are mitigating this very high demand. But I will say, yes, core component of our societies with central bank digital currencies coming to the world of Ethereum is one, and the migration from Web 2 to Web 3 accelerating with very big buckets of users, very big FinTech companies, very big digital companies in general, from the video gaming space or the mobility space, essentially starting to enable their users with digital assets. And it's just a cake which is growing for all of us. And we at ConsenSys really focus on bringing the right tools for the right experience. Should you be a developer with ConsenSys Quorum or Infura, which is celebrating 350,000 users today, or with the end users with MetaMask, getting through the 21 million users this month, which is just an amazing pace. To give you an idea of how fast this space is growing, last year MetaMask was below 1 million users over the summer. This year in November, we are 21 million users, and the marketing has been almost absent so far. So it's just a massive explosion and very organic. 36% of the MetaMask users are coming from Asia, so it gives you also a sense of how much there is traction also here in the region. So really exciting to see that that the growth is organic and coming from multiple fronts.
Thank you. Alan, would you like to share some of your thoughts about the trends?
Yeah. So I think Vinoy as well as Charles have kind of covered a lot of ground. So if I can just add another perspective to this is, I think that over the last few years, I think we've seen increased adoption, at least in the regulated space among financial institutions. The thing to point out there is that as these use cases evolve, one thing that we need to look at is beyond the technology itself. I think there's more conversations around things like interoperability, standardization. Obviously, if there's no adoption, then some of these don't really matter. The other aspect is how do you as it scales out to the enterprise, then how do you maintain a level of requirements around things like privacy and scalability. So I would say that there is that the maturing of the adoption, aside from just figuring out the use cases. So it's not good enough to just say, I can digitally represent an asset. But the question then is, how do I scale this out? And how do I distribute in a more efficient manner? And not just from a technical perspective, figuring out the compatibility of systems. I think there's also a question of aligning, for example, a set of common rule books if you're transacting between different systems, figuring out what's the right governance model, figuring out, for example, from a sustainability perspective, whether a business model for a network, what's the economics behind it. So I think those are things that has become more real, and perhaps that's an area that will need to be evolved in the coming years as the technology gets adopted. The other thing I would also say is, as participation goes up, I think that the tools that we all have needs to be upgraded. We need to also figure out how some of these tools work in tandem with maybe existing infrastructure, and how some of these could coexist and maybe bridge between those two different landscapes. So perhaps these are the few additional points just to round up some of the perspective on the landscape. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, I want to say, with a lot of traditional institutions moving into this space, right? Do we need a big mindset shift? Like for myself, I've been 22 years in DBS, and, like it or not, we are trained to think in a certain way that's very different from how the crypto native people think, right? So are we using, our toolbox, is it too much based on the traditional banks kind of methods for solving things? And does this cause us to be like putting new wine into a wine skin when we move into this space? Maybe Vinoy, you might want to start off this discussion.
Yeah, it's a great question, Daniel, and I don't know whether there's an easy answer to that, and maybe it's something which Charles was alluding to earlier as well, is the Web 1, Web 2, Web 3 kind of a journey which has gone on the internet, if you look at overall. And the other one, which is that I don't think there's going to be one path to this evolution. There are going to be multiple paths. And people will come from different directions. And that is the quite interesting, as well as a challenging part of what the new technology, or what we see, what you're going to see, is that there will be traditional organizations which will have their own migration path in a regulatory or authorized entity within the constraints of that, and within the business models and the clients that they're serving. And there will be people who will want to disrupt this. And they will be fully able to disrupt this, whether if you take, whether you take tokens, or whether you take fungible and non-fungible tokens, both sides. Yeah. So I think we will see both models. And the crux, I would say that while you're right in saying that there's a lot of things which you're seeing in terms of the traditional businesses migrating or testing the waters and then gradually getting into this, but speed is picking up. I think you will see both old wine and new wine starting to coexist in many institutions and organizations.
Yeah. Okay. Alan, Charles, anything to add to this?
Maybe I think the biggest change we will slowly adapt, all of us, is a change of the foundations of trust and how we get the trust built up. Some people will say, "Oh my God, the banks will be replaced." I'm not joining this vision. I think the banks and the financial institutions will remain where people will anchor their trust, but the trust will come and will be communicated and maintained with new tool sets, which will be more digital natively. The other challenge, I think, which we really have to embrace, all of us, is to design better products. Design better user experience, so the transition is really smooth for all these users. I don't think I remember moving from Web 1 to Web 2 and suddenly there was new features and it was great, and I started to spend more time on social media and not consuming passively content from the Web 1. So I think it's a challenge for all of us, from the product designers, the engineers, the regulators, to make sure that there is a safe environment and there is a smooth experience for everyone to move on. But in my opinion, it's really the change of of trust foundations, which is happening before us, and we have to give it some time. It's gonna happen smoothly with everyone's contribution.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think if I could just add on to that, I think it's important to understand what's the problem that we're solving, or what's the nature of the improvements that are being looked at. So you mentioned the point about the toolkit, right? So I think it's important to look at it as a set of tools that you would use, and figuring out what's the problem, or understanding what's the problem and figuring out what's the right tool for that problem. I think that the nature of a lot of technology that we use, or systems that we use today, are not fully implemented today, right? We build on the foundations of what's happening in the past. And likewise, I think the reality is that the implementations that we see, the networks that are being stood up, the DApps that are being written, a lot of these probably build upon work that's been started by our predecessors, in that sense. From that sense, I think there is technologies that be reused. If you take APIs, for example, or or even TCP/IP for that matter, how much of that is really new technology versus old? So I think we need to understand what the problem is, figuring out that with that broaden, I would say a broaden and wider toolkit that we have, what's the right tool to solve the problem. So I think that's something that I think we need to keep an open mind on.
Daniel, maybe just to complement the great input from Vinoy and Alan, what we see here in Asia, in Singapore and other places, is many financial practitioners adjusting to this new environment, and the tagline here is: a new asset will sit on new infrastructure. So rather than trying to change everything from the inside for every single category of your business, should you be a bank or another financial institution, just get the reflex as managers and executives to say that when there is a new asset, it should not straight going to the legacy infrastructure, but really thinking, okay, this new asset is coming, understanding how it's coming, and what should be the rails for it. And one example which comes to mind is the many institutions in APAC in general, which are getting involved with carbon credit trading. So carbon is a new asset. Carbon is coming in different forms, but the tokenized carbon credits seems to have a very strong momentum from all the directions in Asia. And what we see is people naturally taking this opportunity of a new asset to essentially implement this new infrastructure, which will help the legacy systems, will help the legacy assets to eventually, whenever is the right time, whenever there is a framework, how to migrate them safely to this new infrastructure. But I think the opportunity is really here: new asset, new infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ras. Next, I want to talk a bit about how banks are using blockchain. So within DBS ourselves, what we have been doing is that we had used enterprise Ethereum on a permission chain to actually offer security tokens offering, right? So these are basically tokens that are backed by equity, backed by fixed income, and even real assets, that it can be traded on a secondary basis, right? But as we start moving into this space, we start to see that a lot of the regulations that would govern this area would still be based on the traditional Security Futures Act, etc. So it's a lot of traditional regulations that is actually trying to regulate this new space. So perhaps I'm going to invite Alan now to speak a bit about balancing regulations and innovation. So Alan, would you want to take this on?
Sure. So thanks, Daniel. So I think one thing that we are all mindful of is that this is a fast and evolving space, and a lot of to be in this space, I think it's important that you learn very quickly, but probably you need to unlearn and relearn very quickly as well. So I think that in order to basically accelerate and help each other along, I think it's important that we work together together as an ecosystem. I think Vinoy mentioned some of that earlier on. So I think this partnership, this commitment in establishing this ecosystem of both private and public entities, I think is very important. On the innovation side, the the thing that we've been working on is this idea of how do we create a safe space for innovation to thrive, to test out some of these new ideas, however raw it may be, but have that space that allows the experimentation, that it doesn't impact the overall financial stability. It doesn't impact, let's say, the retail investors necessarily. So one of the concrete examples of that is the introduction of regulatory sandbox. We have the FinTech regulatory sandbox stood up and 5 years ago. And through that regulatory sandbox, the idea is, again, innovation in the financial sector within the confined or defined space and time. What are some of the experiments that could be run? And during that period in which an entity, for example, comes into the sandbox to test out some of these ideas, the intention is that we have the appropriate regulatory support in place. In some of these cases, some of these regulatory requirements could be relaxed for that period of time as these innovations are tested. The idea is to contain the consequence of the failure if it does happen, but also be able to support that, give it that space as something it's kind of maturing and growing. So with the sandbox in place 5 years ago, more recently, we've announced the enhancement that we're making on the regulatory sandbox. So we've announced the regulatory sandbox plus, actually. So it's going to be available in January 2022. And the idea is to broaden the definition of participation of innovation. So it's not just the early adopters or the earliest adopters, but really broaden the sense of what innovation is. So we can allow the opportunity for more innovation that's coming through to test out some of these new concepts. Aside from that, make available financial grants to eligible applicants to be able to tap onto that. So basically support them from not just a regulatory support perspective, and also looking at support from a human capital or from a funding perspective. The other piece on that front is also part of the component of the program for eligible applicants is to enroll them in the Deal Friday program to support the companies that are coming through the program get access to investors. So these are kind of a multi-pronged approach that we are taking with the regulatory sandbox plus to create that space for innovation, but also maintain the safety and soundness of the landscape. So I think that's important to balance that. Again, this is something where we need to reset and rebalance every time there's a new technology that's coming up. But we don't want to front run, I guess, innovation. We want to make sure that we take a risk proportionate approach again to innovation and use cases that are coming up. So that's, I guess, the approach that we are taking as some of these new emerging cases that are coming up. Again, for those who have been following this space, I think there's never a down moment. I think that's always a interesting use case, new models. We are talking about Web3, DeFi now. Some of you are looking at DeFi 2.0. There could be a 3.0 something or 4.0 something. But I think that's an evolving space. But as we do that, we want to make sure that it's appropriate safeguards are there so that the right people are protected and while allowing that growth, the standards to be adopted, and the risk to be better understood, so that we create that duality and then support that. So yeah, thanks Daniel.
Thank you. Vinoy and Charles, you want to add anything to this?
Sure. Thanks for that, Daniel. And Alan, very well put. And whenever I hear Alan speak on these things, it's always very reassuring to hear the regulatory position on sandboxes and how they're thinking. It's a pretty, it's not an easy job right now from a regulatory point of view, I think. And I often say that we sometimes focus on innovation and where the future will lie. But as important and probably more important is going to be the transition, the way we transition to the new ways of the technology and the business models. And the two things which Alan sort of touched upon, and I just want to reinforce. One is the pace of change. Yeah, it's very, very different. The pace of change today is just very different. And the second thing is, if you look at from that perspective, the composability of business models makes it very, very hard to define hard boundaries around the scope of regulations and the transition points. It's very hard, right? So for example, it's very hard to regulate around form factors. You can very easily just make something not fit or fit, is sort of thing, right? So I think that makes it very hard. The other one which is there is that if you look at, step back and see what is the purpose of regulations from outside. It's to ensure a healthy, sustainable system in the interest of the economy, industry, and clients, right? I mean, I think that's broadly what it aims to do. And therein lies a dilemma, because what you touched upon and what Alan touched upon is that if you push it too hard, you constrain the innovation, arguably. And a lot of this goes into unregulated sector, right? And which is not desirable either for all those reasons. But if you don't, if you have it too lax, then you're not addressing inherent risks, right? So it's a pretty tight walk from that perspective. And the other thing which adds to the complexity is that I would say level playing field between fintechs and major financial institutions, as well as cross jurisdictions. That doesn't make the life of regulators any easier, I would say. So, but it is an evolving space, and I know, I'm sure, and I know that all regulators are doing their best, but this is something which is going to have a major influence on the way the landscape evolves.
If I could just add on to that as well, I think it's important as well. I think Vinoy mentioned it briefly, but I think it's important that as an entity goes through the sandbox, it doesn't stay indefinitely in the sandbox. I think that you need to grow up in that sense once you've learned. So I think it's important as entities come in, and once they've gone through the program, they need to be mindful that they need to be regulated eventually as financial institutions. So I think that's something that we're mindful of as they perform the role of financial services. They need to be regulated as other financial institutions does. The Sandbox program is intended to be that interim process to understand, contain the risk, but with the view that ultimately you will grow and scale up. So I think that's important. And to Vinoy's point, right? I think it's that being mindful that it's financial institutions that are in place. There are also the non-financial institutions that are coming in. They're trying to, I guess, adopt some of these technologies, try out some of these use cases. So it's making sure that it's an environment that's safe for all, it's competitive, and it supports, I guess, the ecosystem as this service, new sets of services actually comes and it's offered to the ecosystem.
Hi, thank you. Next, I think I'm just going to move towards digital forms of money. As you know that in this space, stable coins has been very popular. You have the range from those that are backed by very small percentage of fiat, like USDT, USDC, to the ones that are more than 90% backed by fiat, like Gemini US dollar and BUS dollar. So what I'm also seeing is that when the institutions move into this space, we are seeing commercial banks issuing e-money, for example, Project Patio, right? And we're also seeing CBDCs now being created. Right. So what I'm thinking is that would this kind of new forms of e-money and that's being produced by commercial banks and CBDCs, would they be able to replace stable coins, right? Such as your USDT, USDC, etc. So I think I'm going to ask Charles his opinion on this.
Daniel, it's an amazing time, and I think the next 18 months will be even more amazing. What's coming our way is branded money. You might have some commercial banks offering to you a Singapore dollar, which is tokenized by their own institutions with the blessing of regulators. You might find some other institutions offering you a US dollar, which will be co-branded or available into their ecosystem, and you will have the CBDC, central bank digital currencies. So what we have here is essentially a competition which was not really existing before in the world of e-money. And the users and the market will get offered the best-in-class money coming from central banks. They will get commercial entities starting to issue the similar currencies within their ecosystem, and it will be a very first. So what I believe is stablecoin and CBDCs will stay and live in parallel, and we're gonna have to take decisions whenever we want to use which. So I foresee there will be probably regulated stablecoins or e-money, which will be really fine-tuned for capital market activities and wholesale. You might find maybe later into your digital life a social media offering to you, for example, a US dollar, which will be perfect for social media-based transactions, and possibly some e-commerce players will start to get different currencies available for cross-border e-commerce. So I think it's bringing competition, it's bringing pressure to everyone to build really good products, and money becomes a product. It used to be very passive, like it represents and you take care of it as it is. And I think with this competition coming into the e-money space, we will see central banks bringing additional features to their digital currencies. Same for the private sector. So it's really exciting. I think the end users will benefit from that a lot. I foresee, and that's the way I see things, is CBDCs will remain like the most trustable assets because they come from central banks. And there is two features of CBDCs which can potentially be implemented and potentially be really a strong value proposition from a product perspective. And what is very interesting is we start to speak about money as a product. And that was not the case before. CBDCs being issued by government-related institutions have potentially, when the time comes, the opportunity to embed KYC information within the currency itself. And this will mean that many more financial institutions and regulated institutions could manage electronic money in a much more efficient way, essentially not separating the KYC and the ML from the asset itself, but embed all this information inside. And there is also something else which sometimes is controversial, but I think there is a value proposition over there. Besides the identity and the currency within the CBDC, you can think also of digital money or CBDCs, which will be essentially calculating VAT and collecting VAT automatically. So I'm really taking the engineer and the product manager hat here, but I think this is really the space where we come in. There is obviously privacy and regulations to consider here, but think of all the hundreds of thousands and the millions of SMEs and little shops, and if you offer them to essentially calculate and do all this accounting from in an automatic manner, there is really very strong features which can come there. And on the private stablecoin side of things, you could imagine having currencies which are designed for capital market activities, which will be helping with the compliance, helping with the regulation into an automated manner. So the space of money as a product is just starting, and there is multiple talents working on the topic. So expect some very, very interesting 18 to 24 months coming. And I think the first big show will be the retail CBDC in China. It has been implemented already in 24 cities. There is more than 50 million wallets which have been open, and the market expects 2022 to be really like the full blast opening for this new digital currency in China. And I think there will be a lot to learn from that experiment.
Would Alan and Vinoy want to add to this?
Yeah, so I think that I think this is a big topic, and whether one will replace the other. I think important to consider what's the use case that we're looking at. Are we looking at looking at cross-border payments, for example? Are we looking at domestic payments, for example? Are we looking at replacement of cash? I think those are questions that we need to look at. So if you kind of double click on CBDCs itself, right? So CBDCs is a direct liability of central banks. It's a payment instrument that's issued. So on either on the wholesale and the wholesale CBDC side, as well as on the retail CBDC side. So there's a bunch of different activities that's happening. On the wholesale side, there are various central banks that are exploring it at the moment. I think a lot of work that's going on the cross-border space on wholesale CBDCs. We have been involved in a number of experiments ourselves, working with other central banks. One recent project that we've had the chance to work was with JP Morgan as well as Banque de France on leveraging Quorum, looking at how we manage liquidity across borders through a multi-currency CBDC network. On the retail CBDC side, I think there's a bunch of different things that are being looked at. I think important to kind of understand, I guess, what's the benefit, what's the problem, the unique value proposition that a retail CBDC offers. And again, this would vary, I think, across different jurisdictions. What might work in one, the same reason if you apply, it could be different, the motivations could be different. Presumably, for example, a country that has very high electronic payments adoption, perhaps it doesn't really move the needle necessarily if there was a digital fiat currency that's being issued. On the flip side, it may be immediately accessible or useful for somebody that doesn't have access to a robust retail payment system. There are other considerations, for example, whether CBDC would really lead to greater financial inclusion, or some would argue less financial inclusion, because some of the CBDC solutions that we see require more sophisticated hardware, wallets, etc. So I think those are things to be looked at and considered. More broadly speaking, whether CBDCs would have an impact on the financial systems. There's questions that needs to be looked at. For example, whether it will lead to disintermediations of banks during stress period. For example, if people prefer to hold CBDCs. So I think those are things that needs to be studied. Again, different countries and jurisdictions have different considerations. From an MES perspective, we've just published a position, a paper on this topic about retail CBDCs in Singapore. What's our latest thinking in this space? So if anyone's interested, can probably take a look at that paper. And on the stablecoin piece, if I could just touch on it a bit, I think I think we also need to be mindful that not all stablecoins are created the same. Some of them have a reasonably high level of backing. Some of them are closer to cash as we know it. Some are not. Some are perhaps closer to securities and versus bank deposits. So I think it's important to understand each of the different properties and figuring out what's the use case. Is it to establish new rails that are being created through these stable coins, and then figuring out how the existing controls needs to be put in place, what's the overall user experience. I think those need to be considered as well, right? Before you can necessarily say that a stable coin, for example, can really take the role of money in that sense. So I think these are few things that we need to look at, understand the use case. What's the unique use case that's not solved with current electronic payment system, understand the motivation in each jurisdiction and the ecosystem that exists of both existing financial institutions, fintech players, and also, I guess, the social economic consideration for each jurisdictions. It's going to be different. Some may be more receptive to digital forms of payments. Others may be more comfortable, for example, with existing forms of payments. Some have a higher tolerance for, or higher tolerance for their records being held privately. Some would prefer or quite comfortable with that record being held and visible from a transparency and integrity perspective. So these are different, I guess, attributes that needs to be considered. So it's not so to your question, I think it's not a straightforward answer that one necessarily is better than the other. I think these are all the different questions that need to be looked at before an answer could be reached. And I think that's still an evolving space. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
and Daniel, I mean, I think from Charles and Alan have covered quite a lot of, so I'll keep it very brief. And I mean, I think for me as well, CBDC is a different category because it's a legal tender, it's a claim on central bank from a liability perspective. So it just gets into a different bucket. On the other side, if I look at it, I mean, I think, tokenization, if you look, allows you to tokenize different asset classes, and you can therefore, and the moment you start going down to that path, you have to say that many tokens could meet the criteria of what the functionality of money is, which is a store of value, exchange, and unit of accounting. I mean, it just gets into a very, very different realm. So what really then starts to matter is adoption. And I think if you look at from adoption, what really matters is trust factor, which Alan and Charles touched upon, is that, is there going to be a backing? What kind of a backing? What's a regulatory treatment, etc. The second is ubiquity, because it's going to be easy to launch many of these things, but building that community is the one which is going to be a challenge around this. And the ubiquity, along with the use cases, is well defined as to who the survivors will be. You will see many, and we are seeing many. So trust, which is from a regulatory and otherwise, plus the ubiquity and the, I would say, the use cases will really determine how many of these we will see around. And there's no rule that only one has to survive or two have to survive. They will coexist, as to Charles' point and Alan's point. Right?
Thank you. Okay, next, I'm just going to move towards the decentralization space. Right? Because as you know, in DeFi space, it's largely based on peer-to-peer transactions without need for KYC. It's quite trustless kind of environment. So what we are thinking is, how should this space, or even this space, should it be regulated or not? Right? And then to add to that, there's actually a question came from the audience to say, is there a way to even tokenize or even DAOify the regulations? I suppose the question that's being asked is that would actually rules can be actually embedded into the smart contracts, right? So basically, I'm gonna leave this question to Alan first to see what he thinks about regulating the DeFi space.
Yeah, so I think it's the way I look at it is, I think there are layers, right? And if you look at DeFi itself, I think there are different things to consider. For example, the type of assets that we're looking at, the nature of how decisions are being made, whether credits is being made available. For example, what kind of activity are we looking at? Lending, borrowing, etc. So I think it's important to look at it from an activity-based approach rather to say, one way or the other. I think that's important as you consider that. And I think it's important to understand maybe the risk and where the risk factors are. Governance, right? So we spoke about DAO. I think that's a whole topic on itself, probably a separate panel on this. But I think just quickly on governance piece, I think we got to figure out, for example, what's the right governance structure, and the answer for each network or each set of applications are going to be very different, I think. In some cases, you're quite happy, for example, to delegate to the smartest person in the room, for example. But how do you know, and how can you be sure, for example, that the smartest person in the room or the person that has the most financial holdings wouldn't act in the best interest of the community? So I think those are things that needs to be looked at as we approach new governance structure. And figuring out what works best for each use cases. So I think it's not obvious that something that it's a straightforward answer, the person that has the most coins, for example, would be the best place to make decision for the community. Likelihood, the ones that has necessarily a single actor acting to make a decision on everybody, then we have to ensure that the single actor is always acting in the interest of everybody. So I think those are things that you look at. The other aspects I would also mention is there's the question of the level of, I guess, control, the level of scrutiny that has to be made. I mean, the current model of regulation for centralized I would say market structure, there is a known entity that you could actually go to if there was an issue. But the event of decentralized finance, or with a decentralized market structure, the question then is there an obvious person that you would turn to for help? I think that in times of when things are going well, we're quite happy with a decentralized approach. But the question then is that for most the same individuals who are quite happy with that decentralized approach, when you move towards a time of crisis, the community would come and support and take the necessary action that's working in your favor. How do we, in those cases, ensure that the folks that have, to make sure that everyone is taken care of, and to ensure that we are not unintentionally or inadvertently marginalizing people through that process as well. So I think that's the level of balance of how much intervention is required, level of accountability, as we look at decentralization that needs to be considered, right? So I think I think that it requires deeper discussions. I think it's and really to kind of unpack what kind of decisions, as again going back to the point about the motivations, the makeup of the organizations, when and who decisions should be made. When do you delegate decisions? And I suspect that if we ask each of us, our comfort levels are going to be different for the different decisions. You may be comfortable, for example, having your better half decide what you might wear on a daily basis, but maybe financial decisions could be a different thing. So I think it's important to kind of look at it and understand it a bit better. So those are quick thoughts on this. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we're going to just move to the Q&A from the audience. So the first question I'm just going to do is a question on a CBDC, which I think this might be directed to Charles. Will CBDC be built on blockchain or central database?
That's a good question. From a technological perspective, the market is going in the directions of CBDCs, which will be token-based and sitting into accounts. So the way you can implement them can be on centralized databases as well as decentralized infrastructure, such as the blockchain. So I believe the market is still open. Some people will decide to implement in centralized databases. Some people will decide to give the choice to the market to implement in the different way. But most probably the same way the internet is evolving to a more decentralized infrastructure. You might have people staying into the legacy systems and legacy infrastructure thinking of centralized databases, but probably the market will pull more the asset and the CBDCs, which will be with higher velocity and more ubiquity, as mentioned, Vinoy, and that's where blockchain will definitely be an infrastructure of choice.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next question I was just going to from the audience is, how will the transmission mechanism for money creation work if CBDCs replace the bonds lending to retail banks? Alan, would you want to take that question?
Yeah, so I think I think a lot of the literature, if you look at some of the papers that are been published by the Bank for International Settlement, I think the few models that are being looked at least from a retail CBDC perspective. There's the direct CBDC approach, that is the indirect approach, or synthetic CBDCs, or hybrid kind of a CBDC approach. So I think there are different models for that. I think at least based on the literature that's put out there, I think a lot of the models that are being discussed still assumes a two-tier kind of a model, where you still have the commercial banks being involved in the distribution process. So I think that seems to be something that's perhaps more popular in existing literature. So in terms of the transmission, the creation could still be done by, in that model, the creation should still be done by the central banks. The distribution could be actually handled through the commercial banks down to the retailers. So it could be a tiered kind of system. So yeah, that's possibly one way. But again, if you look at the different models that exist, there could be other variations of this as well.
Yeah, I
Thank
mean,
you.
and
Yeah.
Daniel, if I may just add a couple of quick points, which Alan was referring to the document, etc. I mean, I think the other thing which you should think about is that at this stage, if you look at the CBDCs, they are more replacing cash and coins in many of the markets, right? So that is one. And then there is also a lot of debate around whether they should be interest bearing or not. And those are some of the things which will have a potential impact on that. And I think also the other bit which is there is that this is an active area of discussion in the industry and within the central banks, which, as Alan was alluding to, there have been several papers on this as well, is that managing the transition and what volumes, and whether it be account-based or token-based, all of these things will have, are there very much on the radar. So it's a good question.
Thank you. Okay, the next question here we have is, cryptos are about separation of money and state. Governments are not stakeholders in the industry, yet they try to assert ownership and control. DAO governance should be about self-governing and not imposition of a third party. Please comment. Who would like to take the question?
I will. I will start, and Vinoy, feel free to jump in. I think there is this constant conversation between crypto and blockchain and governments. What is very important, in my opinion, is to understand that it all sits on the blockchain technology, and you can implement this technology for many different use cases. Use cases could be the use of blockchain for CBDCs and accelerating the digitalization of society and the financial ecosystem. You can also use the same technology to create cryptocurrencies and potentially go into a path which will give you more self-sovereign identity and self-sovereign management of everything you would like to manage. So let's not confuse crypto and blockchain. Blockchain is the foundations of many different projects and progress of the society and our infrastructure. And crypto is one topic which go in one direction. If people start to decide to believe that Bitcoin has a certain value and they want to keep believing this is their own choice. But we should not mix, in my opinion, the different projects, and I think there is a great achievements, should it be in the crypto space as well as government projects using blockchain or enterprise reinventing themselves and bringing great value. So I guess besides the CBDCs, we will find the stablecoin, and most probably we will find digital assets. Some of them will be really on the edge of crypto and very libertarian, and some people will buy into this. And some others will be digital assets, which will be much more neutral, associated with communities, associated with brands or with arts. So it's going to remain a very inclusive internet and ecosystem. So we should be respectful and remain open and as inclusive as we can.
So, Charles, I'll jump in. I think you covered it quite well, but you touched on a very important part, which is that if you look at the technology or what it is capable of sort of satisfying multiple philosophies and multiple points of view. You don't have to have just one single dimension of thinking or single vector on this. It's just capable. You can have a decentralized, completely DAO model running on this, and you could have a permission network. You could have a CBDC potentially using the same. I mean, you go in different directions. I think the most important point, which it is pointing out to, is that this is moving in sync with the way economies and life and culture is evolving, and digitalization of the whole of our life. And what it is also, it's about individualization, which is manifesting itself in that it can satisfy, individual business models. So the NFTs, which Charles briefly touched upon, it just puts the monetization of art or cash flows flowing for usage of art or songs or etc. It just gets to a different business model. And that is a more important point, is that what is a cultural and social transformation, economic transformation, which is pointing to, and there will be room for every different type of business model in here.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. What is the common infrastructure being used by enterprises when we are trying to use Ethereum to get to Web3? For example, we run private credit contracts using Hyperledger Bets2 to run a consortium chain on our own infrastructure with a view to parties to run full nodes on Azure or AWS independently from us.
maybe I can start with this one. The beauty of Ethereum is it offers you the best of both worlds, and in the world of permission chain as well as mainnet applications. So what you are seeing today, and I think it's the right architectures for these different use cases. We see a lot of financial institutions, and we are in an Ethereum Enterprise Alliance kind of financial conversation. We see a lot of institutions, should they be central banks or commercial institutions, building Ethereum private networks where they can be in control of the participants, they can be in control of many things to make sure they fit with the compliance framework of their activities. And they have this optionality to open this network to receive assets from outside, to receive new investors from outside, and essentially doing things in a confined environment, but keeping the connectivity and the native connectivity to the global network that is the Ethereum mainnet or some layer 2s or some other private networks. So I think it's not a singular architecture where everyone will sit. We will be sitting on a common stack, on a common software, following the same standards. But there will be implementations which will be fitting different use case and environment. So we are helping at ConsenSys, for example, private networks from one bank to connect to another private networks of another bank, and both of them are built on Hyperledger Besu or ConsenSys Go Quorum, and they will still need to remain private network and permission network, but they will still want connectivity. Some others will be networks which will be creating digital assets, trading digital assets, and later use the mainnet Ethereum to move this asset to custody, for example. So there is multiple architectures coming up, and I think that's why we see this very strong momentum and this dominance of Ethereum right now is the fact that it is enterprise ready. It comes with multiple vendors. It comes with services. It comes with the Hyperledger foundations being involved and many others, but also this variety of implementation choices which can fit your specific requirements, and that's why you get this very natural and healthy setup where you will find permission networks and public networks sitting and working in a smooth way together.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is someone was asking us to discuss countries choosing BTC as legal tender versus CBDC. Suppose the person wants to know the pro and cons of of choosing either BTC as legal tender versus CBDC. Who would want to take this? Do I want to take this question?
Alan, I know it's a difficult one, but do you want to give it a little try? Why CBDCs and not Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think just on the cryptocurrencies itself, right? I think our view on that is it's probably more precise to call them crypto tokens as opposed to currency for the fact that I think Vinoy did allude to the definition of what I guess money is. But if you kind of look at it from that perspective, and if you look at cryptocurrencies, tokens today, and if you kind of break that out further, all right, today we have definition of whether it's a payments token or whether it's a securities token under the broad crypto token perspective. I think important to understand that if you look at something that's, if you're looking at any of these crypto tokens itself, understand what's the underlying asset that's backing it. I think there's an attempt from a stablecoin perspective to give visibility on that. But if you look at perhaps what I'll describe as crypto native tokens, I think it's important to understand that there's no economic fundamental in that sense for some of these crypto native assets. And from a retail investor perspective, you kind of look at it, you need to understand that it's subject to huge volatility. And that's something that retail investors need to kind of consider and look at. So that's the lens, one lens you can look at it. The other lens is to figure out whether crypto tokens could be used from a day-to-day basis as money in that sense. The other lens is to look at CBDC, whether it's an appropriate form of digital currency. So to me, I think the question may not necessarily be a type of cryptocurrency versus a stable coin versus a CBDC. I don't think it's necessarily these finite choices. I think there is also the idea of existing e-payment systems, and you need to figure out what's the problem that we're solving. Because if you take some countries with instant payment system, it's possible to do an account-to-account transfer today using your mobile phone number as a proxy at zero cost to the user. So if that is the space that you're working with, then where's the value of a digital currency? And if you designate a digital currency that it's not issued by a central bank, then the question then is, I think somebody mentioned or asked earlier on about the impact on money transmission. So I think these are other things to consider. What's the implication there? So perhaps it's less of there are different aspects that needs to be looked at, and probably it's not one versus the other. It's understanding the landscape, understanding the other choices as well, because payments is not really spoken about, I think, in some of these conversations. So I think it's important to also have that as part of the conversation as well. Charles, yeah, I don't know whether you have anything else to add.
No, I think you cover it all, Alan. Thank you for that.
Maybe I can just add a little bit to what Alan's saying. Jump in. I think I agree with Alan. I think there are two different debates. One is about the legal position or what around the BTC and any other token, and some of these has to be tested in terms of what the contractual and legal positions are and how they can survive and be enforceable, etc. And that is to be seen, right? I mean, this is right now very early days. The CBDC addresses a very different debate, which Alan was touching upon. I think when once you get into CBDC, you start talking about central bank liability. You start talking from a money transmission perspective, and also the fact that if it starts recognizing that there's more and more digital commerce, or money is going to be more and more digital, right? And whether in all the wallets or electronic money, you have the same recourse to a central bank money as you have in cash and coins. I think that's a different debate than what's a legal position on BTC, for example. It does address the value exchange, but in the very nature of those two are very, very different. They should be taken as separate debates.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are about running out of time. I would like to thank my panelists for this wonderful and awesome panel. And next, I'd like to introduce James, who is actually the person looking after membership growth for EEA, to come to close this panel. James, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. You sure you guys don't have another hour to talk? I know I could sit here, so thank you very much. Great information. Absolutely. While I'm closing out here, if you guys would like to put any of your social media handles or any way that people could contact, if you want to throw that in the chat feature, that'd be great. But Daniel, Alan, Charles, Vinoy, thank you so much for all this information. Again, very exciting. John Ho, thanks for opening up. I'd also like to throw out a few names. Ken Fromm, also of the EEA, was instrumental in getting you guys together, so appreciate that. Dr. Weijia Zhang, and then behind the scenes, Catherine LaValle and Brittany Mock as well. So thank you all, and absolutely you attendees, thank you for attending. We greatly appreciate it. Again, my name is James Harsh. I am the Membership Growth Specialist here at the EEA. The EEA is a global nonprofit organization tasked with enabling organizations around the world to adopt and use Ethereum technology, ultimately leading to marketplace success in Ethereum. So it doesn't matter if you're a one-person startup or you're an enterprise entity, as long as you're working with the business applications of Ethereum, we'd love to have you become part of the EEA community. So if you would like to learn more, please contact me. Probably the best way to reach me is LinkedIn, James Harsh. You see my name there. Check with me on LinkedIn, shoot me a message. You can find my email, and I'd love to begin communications with you. Also, this recording will be on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to check that out in a few days and share that with your friends and colleagues. So again, I would like to thank all our speakers, our panelists. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you, attendees, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great evening, have a great day, and see you next time. Thank you.